Flannagan, and it's 10 o'clock on the nose. And because I have muted everybody with a code that I am not quite sure I remember, it would be great to put through the chat whether they can hear me or not. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for confirmation. So what I'm hearing is, just Pete can hear me, and Dawn can hear me, and Lamar, and a bunch of other people. Perfect. All right, thank you so much. So we're going to talk about analyzing fail crash data today, and on this, we're going to look. So as we just started, I want to kind of give context for what this webinar is about, or what I think this webinar is about, what I think you think this webinar is about, what we're trying to accomplish. And it's worth noting that because everybody's muted, because there's so many people on this webinar, we're going to do everything by chat. And what that means is, for me, I can't hear or see you, and also I'm monologuing on open loop. So it's a little bit frightening. But anyway, so in this webinar, what sort of came out what was in the material, I'm going to break down crash fatality data into common sense language to give valuable insights, I hope, and into sort of why there's so much variation in fatalities, and why it's actually a little bit hard to look at fatalities from kind of this public safety, public health perspective. And then the hope is that you'll walk away with a better understanding of what drives fatalities, what to do, and then also it was promised that I would be engaging and informative. And so I highlighted certain words that I feel some obligation to attempt to achieve, and we'll see how it goes. But common sense here is the most important of these words, because a lot of the things I talk about, I think what you'll find is you'll sort of say, well, yeah, duh, I already knew that. And my hope is that if that's your reaction, then at least in the future, if you sort of feel some uncertainty, you might think, well, my instincts are good. Common sense actually makes sense, and to some degree, looking at fatalities to understand what we need to do, and particularly how's it going. That's the hard part. Is just challenging, and I'll kind of talk about why. So why isn't this easy? This is referring to data-driven decision making in the public health context, and data-driven decision making in general. So I wanted to kind of lay out what we imagine that the process ought to be. And so if when we were all little kids, we all lay in bed dreaming of what we wanted to do, and we thought, oh my goodness, I'm a driven decision maker, and I want to do public health interventions, and I want to make things better for people on the road. And so what I imagined as a little kid thinking about my future as a data-driven decision maker was that it would go like this. We started out, and so I get a job in 2008 with, let's say, the Office of Highway Safety Planning, and over the last few years, there are 1,100 fatalities on public roads over the last 3 years, and this is clearly a problem, and it's been ongoing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select and implement some countermeasures. I'm going to go dive into the literature on good countermeasures for crash fatalities, and I'm going to implement them, and then I'm going to measure my progress. And in approximately 2011, I look back a couple years, and progress is being made. It's starting to and then I'm going to repeat. And so over time, we get to 2018, and over time, fatalities start to go down. And I get from, in this particular graph, I get from 1,100 down to a little under 900, and I'm feeling good. But what real data looks like for fatalities is this. And in fact, what I did for the illustration was I took all these same numbers and I sorted them, because that's how we kind of want things. That's how we want things to go. And so fatalities look like this, making it really kind of difficult to understand, is what we're doing effective? So we need to sort of understand the major components. Major components of total fatality, exposure, and risk. So exposure in this case, and the word exposure gets used in different ways in different disciplines and so on. But what I mean by that is basically exposure is a measure of travel. So how much are people out there? And then risk is the likelihood of having a fatality per unit of travel. So let's say per mile. And the thing is here that we don't want to, we could reduce fatalities by reducing exposure, but that's not our goal. Our goal is not to get people to stop driving because driving and travel are important to life, and we're about that issue. Some other people might worry about climate and all that sort of thing, but we're not trying to influence exposure. We're trying to influence risk. So it looks like this. We're looking at total fatalities. We can't control exposure, and we want to influence risk. And so it makes it this sort of a little bit of a kind of fuzzy lens for looking at when we're looking at it from a total fatalities perspective. So, what influences exposure? Again, exposure matters because it's going to influence what we are looking at, which is total fatalities, and trying to draw conclusions on. We need to understand influences the different components. The exposure is influenced by a couple of things. One of them is economic factors, and one of them is, and the other is economic factors. And I'm not actually sure what the beeping is. I see that a couple people are commenting on that, and I don't know why it's. So I'm just going to keep pressing on until we can figure it out. So economic factors influence when the economy is better, people travel more, and when the economy is worse, people travel less. Some specific details. Okay, so sorry, Charlotte is saying that the beeping is when people join, and so presumably, it's 10:07. Presumably that'll start to that'll wear off in a couple minutes. So again, I'll just keep talking, keep monologuing. So economic factors like whether people have money to travel, whether they can afford a car, whether they can afford gas, whether they choose to go out and purchase things, that kind of stuff, it influences travel. And then behavior trends, what I mean here is things like there does seem to be, pedestrians will come up in a little bit, and there does seem to be an increase in pedestrian traffic, for example. So more people are out walking. We get e-scooters are kind of a behavior trend. So when suddenly the e-scooters get dropped into cities in Michigan and people are riding around on e-scooters, then you can think of that as sort of an exposure-based behavior trend. But in general, this is really sort of what is influencing exposure over time. Here. Risk is influenced by a number of things. Safety regulations, so I think of that as legislation primarily. Roadway improvements, so specific design, and there's sort of roadway to improve kind of maintenance and structure, but then there are a lot of things that are done to the roads to improve safety, and that can have a big effect on risk. Obviously, enforcement and education are tools in the tool bucket for influencing risk. Important ones, vehicle safety, so vehicle-based countermeasures, and economic factors, which I also mentioned as influencing exposure. Economic factors influence risk by preferentially influencing some subsets of the population over others. So specifically, the kind of thing that happens with economic factors is younger people in particular, and who are riskier drivers on average, are kind of more influenced by changes in the economy. They're more sensitive to economic factors. And so one of the other things that sort of happened in the economic downturn from a number of years ago was that young people were kind of pulled out of the driving population more than other sort of groups. So for this audience, the big sort of countermeasure options or the risk influencing opportunities, if that makes sense, are mostly going to be roadway enforcement and education, but there may be other vehicle safety folks or legislators here, but this is sort of kind of the emphasis about a model that, so my colleague Jim Lower led a study a few years ago to understand, the goal of the study was to understand why fatalities went down so much generally in the years from like 2008 or so to 2011, 2012, which was I think we're calling it the Great Recession now, but the significant economic downturn from the last decade or so. And so we put together data from states all across, from all the states, and put together a model. And we just had tons and tons of potential predictors for fatalities, including a whole bunch of things that were sort of measures of safety regulations or of kind of the way, safety countermeasures. We had a whole bunch of them that were expenditures on roadway improvements, including safety-specific roadway improvements, expenditures on law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had a whole bunch of predictors that were just economic indicators and again, we had vehicle miles traveled for travel. So there's a whole bunch of potential predictors. We put together a model that predicted at the state level year-over-year change. So if fatalities were at, 1,000 for Michigan in 1 year, this model would predict, would they go to 1,010, would they go to 1,090 the following year? And what we found was that 84% of the year-to-year change variation, of the variation in year-to-year change, 84% was attributable to economic factors, 10% attributable to changes in travel, and 6% attributable to changes in safety regulations. And there are a couple of specific predictors here. That doesn't mean that other safety countermeasures aren't effective. It was just this particular kind of 10,000-foot view prediction model. But the key takeaway from this slide is literally when you're looking at fatalities and you're looking at change from year to year, you're looking through like the fog of 84% economic influences, 10% travel, and then trying to sort of see down to what did my safety countermeasures do. So this is why it's hard. This is why there's variation that makes it hard to tell, is what I'm doing? Are my countermeasures working? Am I making a difference? Do I need to change? Do I need to change strategy? Do I stay the course, et cetera, which is really ultimately the kind of decision making that we're trying to get to here. So, and just to sort of again kind of emphasize the role of the economy here, this is a graph of the model that I was just talking about applied to Michigan data specifically, and you see the orange circles are the actual fatalities, called fatals, the actual counted fatalities for each year, and the blue ones are the predicted fatals for that time. And what you can see is that the blue model does a great job of tracking the actual fatalities. And then there's this sort of weird pattern where we've got wibbliness in the that's a technical term, wibbliness in the actual fatalities, and then the model is kind of tracking the wibbles pretty well, and then at the end the model just like cruises out on a straight line out into the future with a nice little kind of steady down prediction in that particular case. So what's going on here is this model is doing a great job of predicting fatalities based on economic data that looked backwards. So at the end of each year, the economic numbers, the median income, the unemployment, these kinds of things, they come out. We have them in our data set, we look back, and we say, oh yeah, our model did a great job of predicting year-over-year change, and we can see that when we know what the economic conditions were for that year. Looking into the future, though, you can see that we're not tracking the ups and downs here. We're just making guesses about how things are going to go in the future. The guesses come from somebody else's guesses about the economy, and it turns out that people are actually terrible at predicting. And realistically, if they could predict the economy, they'd probably be rich. So this is a basic challenge in understanding fatalities. So how do we do data-driven decision making? How do we go about looking at fatalities? So the in-principle process here is look at data, identify problems. Oh, where did the fatal line? Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take questions. Sorry, there's a question popping up, and I'm going to. I have about 30 minutes presentation, so 15 more minutes, and then I'll take questions at the end, and I'm trying to save maximum time. So keep them coming, and then I'll start taking the questions from the chat. So the in-principle process for data-driven decision-making is look at data, identify problems and trends, implement countermeasures, check to see if it works. We sort of talked about that before. This is what I dreamed of as a small child. So how do we do that? So we start by identifying trends, and the first place to start is this mechanism. And this is one of these, boy, this is common sense, right? So if your countermeasures are specific to a crash mechanism, which they certainly will be, so countermeasures are going to be specific to, they can be specific to a location and the kinds of mechanisms of crashes that occur at that location. I say, it's a roundabout or a crosswalk or whatever, so I've sort of written some general categories, but the point is that our countermeasures are directed at certain kinds of crash causation, and so when you're tracking that for looking at fatalities, you want to focus on that. If you're going to implement a countermeasure at a location, you want to look at crashes at that location, obviously. If you're going to implement a countermeasure for pedestrians, you want to look at pedestrians. And so I know that everybody in this room already does this. It's common sense, it's obvious. This is an appropriate starting. The next thing is to look at both long and short-term trends, because they can look really different. And here's an example. In general, I'm not a particular fan of the 5-year view. I think that some amount of sort of planning documents and the way that I think the federal agencies want numbers kind of coming through is that often the 5-year view is kind of a component of that, and it's fine. But the 5-year view, because the short-term change is so influenced by the economy's ability to change quickly, which is very different from changes that come from safety countermeasures. Safety countermeasures work slowly. They work slowly and over time. And it hardly matters, it doesn't matter what kind of, so if you have safety countermeasures that are done at the roadway level, you theoretically should see a pretty quick change in fatalities at that one specific location, but in that situation, you need data over a long haul, and its influence on the greater problem is, one location at a time. When you implement seatbelt laws and seatbelt enforcement and education, over time you build a culture of seatbelt use. So it isn't as though you put up a billboard and everybody suddenly goes, oh wow, I should have buckled up. It's the long, slow process. And so these long, slow trends are operating visibly at the long view and not so much visibly at the short view in the context of the economy producing all kinds of variation in fatalities. So we look here at pedestrians, and in the short view, it's just hard to know what's going on. In the long view, you look and you think, well, looks like pedestrian fatalities are going up. That's consistent with trends that I know are occurring nationally. We think that there are more pedestrians out there, and that's actually separately but anyway, so this is kind of the difference in that view. And so as another example that I took to kind of work through this process is look at alcohol in the short view, and alcohol related fatalities appear to be going up over the last 5 years. But when you take sort of long view, you get this really weird pattern, specifically that just in 2017, and we don't yet have the 2018 data, there was this big spike in alcohol-related fatalities that almost put us back to 2004 levels. So you might look at this, and we do see kind of the general declining trend through the middle there, which is weirdly smooth. Also happens to coincide with the economic downturn, and then suddenly the sort of spike up. But 31% increase over 2016 it's very hard to imagine that there was sort of a specific mechanism behind it that we need to kind of combat. So that begins to look very sort of suspicious. Hard to know, right? So what do we do? So the first thing to do then at this point today, say what the heck is going on? First thing to do is try to remove exposure from the picture. I care about risk. I care about the risk associated with alcohol. I may care about an increase in drunk driving, so you could sort of think of that as exposure as well. But in general, my countermeasures are designed to get people to not do this, to influence the take when they're driving. So if they drive sober, it's lower risk. If they drive drunk, it's higher risk. And I'm hoping to kind of influence that, to push against the risk. So the first thing I need to do is know how travel patterns have changed, because every type of crash would be expected to go up by whatever the kind of percent increase in general travel there is, just as a base rate. So I want to know what the travel patterns are. I just need to have that pattern in my mind. Then I want to look at both at the total counts, because they matter, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then I want to look at counts per VMT, or if I don't have VMT, because sometimes VMT it comes a little bit later in kind of the planning time framework, I tend to actually look at counts per crash. So I can think of total crashes as a bit of a stand-in. Total collision reported crashes is kind of a stand-in for exposure, for how many. So the crashes should generally go up with travel, generally go down as travel goes down, and so you can use that as kind of a proxy. So the counts themselves importantly tell you about the size of the problem. We can never get away from that. That is, if we focus exclusively on risk, we can actually end up diving into problems that might be high risk but low exposure. And in the end, it's less important to solve those problems. So we have to keep maintaining focus on the counts to understand the size of the problem. But counts per VMT or counts per crash can tell us how much the problem is really driven by, and I say here, driven by exposure. What we're doing is removing exposure. So if the feature of the graph goes away when we take out exposure, then we begin to think, well, this seems to be somewhere exposure. So one thing to sort of, memorize or stick on the bulletin board is what exposure patterns look like in Michigan over time. And I've plotted a couple of different ways. So the orange curve is total VMT over time. And you can see the reduction in VMT that occurred. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the reduction in VMT occurred during the economic downturn, starting, heading down in 2008, down in sort of 2009, and down through 2012, and then started to kind of come back up. It doesn't look like much on this graph, but if you look at the gray curve, which is plotted on the right axis as a percentage of 2001, you can see that the variation in VMT has ranged from a almost increase and almost a 4 or 5% decrease relative to 2001. So that's a pretty big. So if you're 6% up from 2001, you would actually expect on average to see 6% increase in fatalities relative to 2001 without all of the things. So it's worth just kind of knowing what that looks like, so that when you see this basic same pattern in crashes, you sort of say, well, that looks like the the downturn followed by the economic recovery, and so on. So then going back to sort of so I had this weird spike in alcohol. So then I thought, well, okay, take a look at let's kind of remove exposure. So now I'm looking at the percent of all crashes that involve alcohol over time. So I've now kind of removed as best I can the sort of exposure piece, and I'm looking at just how is alcohol behaving as a percentage of all crashes. And what you see is this sort of steady downward trend, and it's been really flat for the last 5 years, the standing tiny tick. But this suggests this is not consistent with. This is not sort of showing that strong effect that I was seeing in the other graph, and it suggests that there's not suddenly a pro-drunk driving movement, or that something crazy didn't happen in 2017 that led to that. What it does mean, which is a little weird, is that the number of fatalities per drunk driving crash must have actually been high in 2017. So we graph that, fatalities per 100 drunk driving crashes, and we see that exact same pattern sort of showing up at the end. That the rate. So this is, again, think about this. So a drunk driving crash occurs. Lots of them are single vehicle runoff roads. Some of them are head-on. Some of them, they come in sort of different flavors, and some number of people die as a result. This is suggesting that for some strange reason in these sort of recent years, more total people have died as a result of those crashes, but there weren't necessarily more crashes per mile. So that feels like a vehicle safety problem. It's possible that there were fewer drunk people wearing seatbelts, so that would sort of increase their risk. But in general, this is not an indicator of of anti-drug driving countermeasures that the people in this audience would sort of would be looking at. So, is it random? Possibly. So then if we want to go further at that point to try to kind of track this down or track other things down, then the question can become, is the problem, so sometimes you actually just get weird blips in again, fatalities, relatively small numbers in the grand scheme of statistics, and so sometimes you just get weird blips that happen, that big crash on I-94 with the, 99 vehicle pileup, presumably just really messed up. It was one really bizarre event, but it spiked up really high numbers. So we can sort of take a look for this kind of thing. We can break the problem down. We might want to break things down also because we want to understand what is, and I'll talk about this in the sort of summary slides in a second, but, who is the audience for a given countermeasure? Who is the audience for the problem? So in the case of this sort of alcohol situation, I did a couple of breakdowns, and essentially what happened was, well, not a young driver thing. This green dotted line is plotted on the right-hand axis because it's the big one. The green one is there is no young drivers. So I have different ages of young drivers involved in a crash. The green one is by far the biggest number of crashes because it's the biggest number of drivers, basically any crash that occurred without a young driver. And this is, the numbers went up. It's attributed. We can count approximately 50 of the extra 84 crashes in this kind of drunk driving scenario, but that's a big group. That's where I expect to find most of them. So there's nothing really interesting here. Similarly, when I look by vehicle type, I was thinking, maybe it was a motorcycle thing, I don't know, but this passenger car is also graphed on the right side of this graph. And again, the big increase is occurring with just the big group. So that's not super informative in this case. It just means that, wow, there was this effect. We saw this weird effect. We're continuing to see it. It's kind of happening everywhere. So it's happening in the sort of bulk of the crashes. And I also looked at things like I looked over time and I looked over space, and and to be honest, I haven't sorted this out. I haven't looked at seatbelt yet, but the point of all this is when these effects are distributed widely over time or space or vehicle types, or they're all happening during, clear conditions in the light, it looks a lot like a random process. So something kind of random happened. It happened here and there. Most crashes are daytime drive conditions because most driving is daytime drive conditions. So it's all just, there's nothing sort of special that needs to be attended to. So when we think about data-driven decision-making, the year-over-year crash data can really help with measuring problem size, so understanding how many people could be affected by my countermeasures, and aiding in prioritization of countermeasures in the way that you guys are already doing, is sort of trying to tackle big problems while at the same time trying to make sure that countermeasures are also applied to people all over the state and so on and so on. But problem size really matters. Big problems are, hopefully give you bigger results with respect to reductions in fatalities. The year-over-year crash data can also help with identifying focus subgroups. So that can be where is the problem happening, that can be who is involved, it can help you target countermeasures to the right audience. So especially education and enforcement are kind of targeted. And so if you're trying to improve the general condition of texting while driving in the state, that's going to be heavily young people. And you'll see that in the crash data. And so you can sort of target advertising or target messaging to places and mechanisms that young people, where young people are the bulk of the audience, that kind of thing. And again, I'm sure that these are all things that you're doing already. Long-term trends are much better for measuring real progress. So countermeasures work slowly but steadily when looking for the public health view. So this is the 10,000-foot view. So, we've seen that in a number of ways. It takes time, and it is kind of steady in the way that the economy is not a steady feature of crash data. Specific location improvements, could show quick improvement in the local area, but then the numbers, you need those long time frames to really sort of sort out whether you've stabilized, and just to measure enough numbers. And so one of the promises was to sort out, like what's driving traffic fatalities, the big problems that you're already thinking about have been around for a really long time, and they continue to be the big problems that that are going on now. So seatbelts are very effective, but if people don't wear them, they're not effective. Young drivers, it seems mean to call them big problems, but young drivers, through a combination of inexperience and to some degree sort of risk-taking characteristics of younger people, do have higher risk, demonstrably higher risk, and so graduated driver's licensing and so on has helped a lot. And actually, if you look at the long view on young drivers, there is a steady downward trend. Alcohol is extremely risky, and obviously steady downward trend in general nationally in terms of the amount of driving, of drunk driving, but still a big component of fatality. Distraction is a problem. And then the other really key thing is that it is, in choosing countermeasures, it's really important to rely on research and the literature that has been done at sort of a greater aggregated level that says, yes, this stuff works. Because it is often the case that when you look at the kind of immediate effect, and this is kind of the theme that I'm talking about, is that at the state level, fatalities will go up and fatalities will go down. And if you use that as a way to sort of say, our alcohol countermeasures aren't working, we're going to have to do something else, which again, I don't think is what you're doing. The problem is you can be motivated to just be switching around all the time on the basis of this sort of variability, and particularly the economy-driven variability in crash counts. But countermeasures that have been evaluated at through research means and at a kind of aggregated level across the country and even in other countries should work. And so believing in that, in those results, independent of whatever the kind of immediate measurement return is still worthwhile, because of the fact that the effect you're trying to have is really being, is to some degree sort of hiding behind economic change. So this is really, again, the long view. I think it is also worth pasting this one up on your wall, which is to say that over time, the green one is fatality rate per million BMT in Michigan, and the blue one is total fatalities, and it's all going down. The improvements in vehicle safety, all of these sources of safety are working, and so this, by sort of standing out to this level, you can see that there are these big variations here, but it's working. Just my basic summary is trust your instincts. It is the economy. Separate exposure from risk. That's a big, just as a strategy. Separating exposure from risk. Think about that all the time. Is what I'm seeing exposure is what I'm seeing changes in risk. Don't judge the success of a countermeasure by a few years of data, and take the long view. And I want to thank the Michigan Traffic Fatality Trends team here at Country and the Office of Highway Safety Planning. And now I can start taking questions. And I see that SoundCloud is quick out of the gate, and so 2 questions from them. Where did the fatal model come from? I can send you. So I talked about it last year at the safety summit, but the model was built off of the observations were at the state level, and so we gathered up as much data as we could on sort of these sort of state characteristics like BMT, rural BMT, all together. We had probably 100 different predictors: population, young proportion of the population beyond median income. And then we built a model from those data that predicted fatalities of those states, or change in year-over-year fatalities. So that was produced a few years ago, led by Dan Blower. And again, I can talk offline with you sort of more details about that particular model. Smoothing, 3 to 5 year rolling averages, yes, certainly. So again, smoothing is helpful for taking some of the jitter out of there. It doesn't stop the sort of fact of the economy having the ability to make sort of higher change. The economy changes things at a high rate, which shows up even in the 3-year sort of smoothing, whereas safety changes at a slow rate over a large period of time. But you're right that smoothing is one is an additional beyond what I was talking about is a good means of kind of making sure that you're not focusing too heavily on sort of weird what's year to year. Okay. Okay, so fatal model. So sorry, Michael says, Montcalm County averaged 8 or so fatalities per year for about the past 10 years. 2016, they had 6. At the end of 2016, they eliminated the road patrol. In 2017, they had 23 fatalities on 19 crashes. Big increases. The economic conditions definitely did not change at the, let's see, what is that? 6 to 23 is on the order of 400% increase. How does fatal model change? The problem, so one big problem that you have is that the numbers are tiny and small numbers can change a lot. And I thought about putting that in just sort of little demos of pure randomness. But a 400% increase, even in small numbers, is worrisome. And to the extent that it's linkable to the road patrol becomes a really interesting question. I think that the fatality model, the economic change, unless there was really extreme economic change in Montcalm County, the fatality model is unlikely to predict anything like a 400% increase in fatalities. And so I think that's a situation where if you're looking at a single year increase from 6 to 23, you're looking at small numbers which can change by much larger percentages. But on the other hand, that is so big that I think I would feel some concern. That I would begin to feel that there's a possibility that for example, the change in the road patrol or other possible changes that occurred really had an influence. The 2018 data will be out, within the next couple of months, and so it'll help a lot to take a look at that, see when you sort of see a flatness. But that's my best guess, just off the top of my head. Okay. Yep. Other questions? Okay. With vehicular cost increases, enhancements in safety technologies, and connected and automated vehicle technologies becoming more integrated, are you expecting to see a drop similar to that of the seat belt? Yeah. So vehicle safety. I wanted to talk about that a little bit and decided that I couldn't cram it into the 30 minutes. So it's a great question. Thank you very much. Vehicle technologies are proving, particularly the more automated ones, and I talked about this also last year at the Safety Summit. So technologies like automatic emergency braking, so the more automated, the better they seem to work. So AEB, automatic emergency braking, which puts on the brakes, we're estimating 50% in rear-end crashes. Now, rear-end crashes are not actually the big fatality driving crashes, but they are extremely common, and they do produce fatalities. And so that level of, the seatbelt has that kind of level of improvements in risk, and in this case, in sort of crash involvement. And the main thing about vehicle safety technologies is that they just take, the vehicle fleet turns over about every 20 years. So when we talk about the kind of long haul, vehicle technologies have that same quality, which is that it takes, it just takes a long time to get into there. So one of the things that's worth thinking about in this context is vehicle technologies are targeted right now at certain kinds of crashes. So AEB is targeted at rear-end crashes. Some of the lateral, like electronic stability control, which is also extremely effective and is now mandated, is targeted at loss of control runoff road crashes, which, by the way, are different from the typical runoff road that you get from alcohol, but also rollover. And so to some degree, if you know that stuff is coming down the pike and you know that stuff is effective, you can kind of redirect your energies at other kinds of crashes. So it would be great to get rid of distractions. It would be great to get people to stop texting, and I wouldn't ever advise not worrying about it. But the reality is that AEB and automation in general will begin to solve that problem in the long haul, whereas other problems are going to be sort of are potentially being less well addressed by vehicle technology. So it's worth kind of thinking about those. PowerPoint will definitely be available. I'll send it, and then Jessica can send it out to everybody. Add vehicle. Yeah. So sometimes says it'd be nice to add the vehicle enhancement and other laws on the fatal rate graph, the correlation of improvements to crash results. Yeah, we had in that model, we did have one sort of like a kind of a model year based catch-all vehicle improvement factor, and we felt like that could have been improved and have been sort of thinking about that a little bit. But I think that's a thing that could definitely improve the model. And then to your point, the sort of fatalities and fatal rate, it's a little bit tricky to add vehicle improvements on that graph, mainly because you have to dig into the kinds of crashes that are addressed by vehicle improvements. But I totally agree that just newer model year vehicles are safer than older ones, and that just is a steady improvement. And then you can sometimes point to these sort of specific things. So I'll see what I can figure out how to do that. Next question: do I see anything regarding speed? I haven't looked closely at speed. I guess I'm going to answer that as I don't know about speed, but I think but it's been repeatedly shown to be a really important factor in fatal crashes, and it is possible to look at it in the data. So I'm sort of, I realize that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I can go back and do stuff up a little bit. Fatalities attributed to cell phone use. Great question. So this is really difficult to answer. The kinds of crashes that are most sensitive to distraction are rear end crashes, which, while common, are actually generally not nearly as damaging, not nearly as likely to kill people, and single vehicle run off road, which is typically related to drifting off the road. So you get distracted, you're not paying attention to your lane keeping, you drift off the road, and in some cases of drift off, there is some object that is a really bad thing to hit. So we, you have to imagine the air quotes, but we sometimes refer to these as drift off and bad luck, in the sense that people who drift off the road and hit something, aren't, like, they're typically not speeding, they're typically not too fast for curve, they're typically, it's not that kind of dynamic. It really is this very kind of drift, and then there was something there, and that proves to be a bad thing. So I think that the drift off sorts of crashes are actually the more damaging of the, there are more fatalities from those, at least at a rate, that could then potentially be attributed to cell phone use. But the research that's been done so far attributing fatalities to cell phone use has actually really been very broad. So there was an estimate from the National Safety Council that was like 25% of fatalities are attributable, and it was pretty clear that the methods that they used were pretty quickly kind of debunked. So my current understanding, my current sense of things is that texting is extremely high risk. Typically done in, again, the rear end scenario, while not good, is not the one that is most likely to kill people. The drift off road and texting. So texting is without question, a bad idea, but how many fatalities are attributable is a whole other question. So that was again, unsatisfactory answers. Let me check that. Yep. Do you account for crash data in rural areas? Could you clarify the question? So Rachel, if you could sort of expand on that question, then I'll run through some of these other ones, and then I'll get to that. I apologize. and some statements, simply the year in which things happen, qualitative, I'm also a little unsure. So, Dean, great, thank you. Research is underway to gain a greater understanding of the changes in speed across Michigan. Very helpful. Accurate way to measure BMT of motorcyclists to exposure. Good question. I'm actually Dean or somebody may actually have a better answer to that. One option is to take a look at the National Household Travel Survey, which unfortunately is only done every 7 years, but fortunately came out just recently, was done in 2017. And at least you can kind of begin to look at the proportion of miles of travel, and you can do this at the level of Michigan per se, the proportion of miles of travel that are motorcycle miles. And then there's other research that looks at the relative risk per mile of motorcycle travel versus car travel that can begin to dig into it. But that's a tough one and a really important one. Same problem with pedestrians and bicyclists. Yeah, okay, Rachel. So when the population is small and crashes are low, what's the best way to determine what the problem is? That's a great question, and that's kind of going back to the Montcalm County question as well. Aggregation is well, there are a couple things. Aggregation is your friend with respect to samples. So the idea there is that at the rural level, specific individual locations are going to be very difficult to identify as this is a problem location where you're really limited to whatever the data are there. Oftentimes what I've read, and this is a little out of my expertise, but I've read a number of things, particularly coming out of sort of federal highway supported work on systemic and systematic kind of approaches to safety. So instead of trying to identify the one place in a rural area that needs to be addressed, it's more along the lines of, are we seeing a lot of rural area crashes on curves? Do we see run-off road on curves on rural roads? Should we be rethinking generally whether curves should be, whether there should be additional infrastructure improvements for curves, or are we seeing crossing the median? We have countermeasures like median rumble strips that potentially are, in relatively speaking, low-cost way to sort of improve the safety of rural roads where you're dealing with traffic that's traveling, in proximity to each other, unlike urban roads. So, but yes, aggregation, and then also national trends that you see in national data are likely to be relevant for Michigan as well. Not guaranteed, but often. So yeah, NHTSA says 20% of 2017 vehicles had new braking. Right, this is exactly the thing, is that the new braking features are on the most expensive vehicles right now. They're very effective, but it just takes a really long time for them to get into the fleet. And one interesting thing was the ESC mandate, the electronic stability control mandate in 2009, had this really interesting effect, which was that suddenly everybody had to start having ESC on virtually all vehicles starting approximately 2009. And you can see in the data it had a really big effect. And so mandating really, mandating seatbelts, mandating airbags, mandating these things does have the effect of helping to speed up the fleet penetration, but of course there are critical issues. Yep, yeah, Dean, exactly. So if you are part of a smaller population of crashes, you can use data from a similar set of locations. So this is the sort of aggregation problem that you can aggregate from similar locations and think about the general risk factors associated with those locations. And similarly, you can work on kind of national size databases with sort of statistics to understand risk factors. Fatalities, so Bruce is asking, what does data show for fatalities on motorcycles since the helmet law repeal? Yeah, wow, that's a super interesting question. We've been analyzing it every year since the helmet law repeal, and one of the the real puzzle there is, and actually, talk about this a little bit. There is a theme in other areas. So people who don't wear motorcycle helmets are taking risks relative to those who wear motorcycle helmets. You can clearly see in all kinds of data that the risk of fatality, the risk of serious injury for the same crash, like all, it's holding all sorts of characteristics of the crash constant, that the risk of fatality or injury is less if you wear a helmet. So helmets are clearly a good thing, but don't wear helmets are also often people who are taking other kinds of risks. So speeding and drunkenness while motorcycle riding is associated with low helmet use. And so what happens then is in the data, the people taking those kinds of risks, riding a motorcycle while drunk or speeding on a motorcycle, often end up in fatal crashes, even when they're wearing helmets. And so the overall effect of the law was, instead of, what we expected, this sort of big increase. So what the helmet, about 25% of the riding population stopped wearing a helmet, more or less. 25 to 30% doesn't wear a helmet. But because so many of those people were in the risk-taking category with a helmet, and they're in a risk-taking category without a helmet, the overall effect of fatalities has actually been a little bit less. It's not been like a 25%. There has been an increase in fatalities, but again, it's damped a little bit because of this kind of confluence of multiple risk factors for people who previously were wearing a helmet, but it wasn't enough to switching over to people who aren't wearing a helmet. I hope that makes sense, but it's a pattern that we see in other areas as well. Aggregation, yeah, good question. Sorry, please define aggregation. Aggregation just means gathering up data from others. This is kind of what Dean was talking about, which is if you're trying to look at rural areas where very few crashes occur, trying to find data from other places that are still meaningful for your problem. So in other words, let's say again, going back to the curve thing, we're worried about curves in rural areas on rural roads. What you can do is look at the crash data across the state for the same sort of types of roads, but maybe not the ones in your area that you're worried about, and also look at whether the crash occurred on a curve or not. So, what is the general, are curves of some size or curvature producing particular risk? Are we seeing a greater number of run-off-road crashes when let's say the curvature is tight? Or I'm kind of making this stuff up, but essentially aggregation is really trying to reach out to other similar locations for information that will apply to the location that is kind of in your purview. And so so crash rates compared to other state data, yeah, I think that other state data can be very helpful in understanding how to think about Michigan data. And this is this idea of, again, aggregation. So when I think about aggregation as a strategy, what I'm really saying is small numbers are really hard to cope with. And so we got to learn something, and if we're going to learn something, we need more data. And so the next best thing to more data is similar more data. So that might be other states, and that might be other locations, but we're always thinking about, trying to sort of gather information from things that are as similar and therefore as kind of generalizable or as applicable to our own situation as possible. Aggregation of data work for behavior side of traffic safety. Sure, yeah, in a rural area like UP. So it's the same thing, which is to say, what's going on with rural crashes? We're not going to be able to say what is happening at this rural intersection here, because hardly anybody's passing through it. But we are going to be able to say, when we look at the group of crashes that are rural crashes, which is a good 30 to 40% of Michigan crashes, arguably rural, and certainly a big percentage of crashes from other states, are we seeing, as a general pattern, are we seeing run-off road as a particular problem? Are we seeing drunkenness? So you're talking about behavioral. So are we seeing speeding? Are we seeing drunkenness? Are we seeing distraction? Are we seeing, what is the sort of collection of behaviors? Our seatbelt use rates lower in rural areas. You can look at seatbelt use rates in crashes and get some idea of whether that's true. And by looking more broadly across the state of Michigan and even tapping into states like what you think about northern Wisconsin. So Wisconsin data from the north and northern Minnesota have a lot of similarities to UP, presumably. I mean, that's, sort of somewhat assuming, but culturally and kind of behaviorally. And so to the extent that we aggregate to those areas that are like the UP, it might be effective in trying to understand what are the primary behavioral issues that we're seeing. And then you can go back and look at the UP and say, well, do we see, are we kind of seeing a preponderance of speeding or drinking or whatever kind of the order of issues is? You might begin to confirm what you're learning from the aggregated data. Legalize marijuana. They do not see a spike in traffic fatalities. I'd be happy to sort of send, there are a number of articles looking at it. What happens is you see an increase in people who test positive for marijuana among fatalities. But in some states there is a suggestion, well, the research is sort of the amount of increase in fatalities, and this is of course happening at a time with also a general increase in fatalities from the economy. The amount of the increase isn't really reaching statistical significance, but that doesn't mean there isn't an increase. So the work on legalized marijuana as a kind of a cause of increases in fatalities is still a little bit, the answer is a little bit up in the air. But I don't think that we expect a sort of super steep spike as recreational marijuana comes into play. I think we expect some potential increase, and we certainly expect to see more positive tests for people who have for fatal. Okay. So Dean is saying, thank you, you're welcome. Based on the questions. And a lot of questions can be answered by using the Michigan Traffic Crash Facts Query tool. And I would be happy to, if you guys want to catalog questions that are kind of coming in, I would also be happy to try to just put them in a document and type up some answers, or we can have some offline. You're welcome to email me. Sorry, Marv is so there's a big increase in positive marijuana tests in victims of fatal crashes, so people who die in crashes in the states that have legalized or decriminalized marijuana. But that doesn't necessarily, those deaths are not necessarily caused by the marijuana, and in particular because there's so again, I'm not arguing that smoking marijuana and driving is a good idea, definitely, but it's a little unclear how it affects the bigger picture of fatalities, other than certainly to affect the blood test results of people who are and because fatal cases are tested at a very, very high rate with sort of the full toxicology screen. We also see this. So I think sort of final. You're welcome, Dan. Oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you. I'm glad this is good information. You're welcome. And I will send out the PowerPoint and there's a couple of papers, especially about awesome, Patrick. Thank you. There are a couple of papers about marijuana, and I'll take a look at some of the other questions and see whether there are some things that we can send out just to the group to answer some of these questions better than I've done. But keep the questions coming, and otherwise, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks again.